Chapter 6, Gilded by Marissa Meyer. Sometimes Cyrilda would spend hours thinking about evidence, those little clues left behind in a story that bridged the gap between fantasy and reality. What evidence did she have that she'd been cursed by Wordith, the god of stories and fortune? The bedtime tales her father had told her, though she'd never dared to ask if they were real or not, the golden wheels over her black irises, her uncontrollable tongue. A mother who had no interest in watching her grow up, who left without so much as a goodbye. What evidence was there that the Earl King murdered the children who got lost in the woods? Not much, mostly hearsay. Rumors of a haunting figure that stalked through the trees listening for a child's frightened cries. And long ago, once every generation or so, a small body discovered at the forest's edge, barely familiar, oft picked clean by the crows, but parents always recognized their own missing child, even a decade later, even when all that was left was a corpse. But that had not happened in the recent memory, and it was hardly proof. Superstitious nonsense. This, however, was different, quite different. What evidence did Cyrilda have that she had rescued two moss maidens who were being chased by the wild hunt, that she had outwitted the Earl King himself? A golden ring and a necklace warm against her skin when she woke. Outside, a square of dead grass revealed where she had shoveled away the snow, an open cellar door left unlocked, and wood still smelling of raw onion. But not, she noted with bewilderment, hoof prints or tracks left in the fields. The snow was as pristine as it had been when she'd come trekking home the night before. The only footprints she saw were her own. There had been no mark left behind of her midnight visitors, not the delicate feet of the moss maidens, nor the clomping hooves of the horses, nor the lupine tracks of the hounds. Just a delicate field of white glittering almost cheerfully in the morning sun. As it soon turned out, the evidence she did have would do her no good. She told her father the story, every word a singular truth, and he listened, rapt, even horrified. He studied the seal of the ring and the locket's portrait with speechless awe. He went out to inspect the cellar door. He took a long time staring out at the empty horizon, beyond which lay the ashen wood. Then, when Cyrilda thought she could stand the silence no longer, he began to laugh. He stood a long time staring out at a full belly laugh tinged with something dark that she couldn't quite place. Panic? Fear? You'd think by now, he said, turning back to face her, I'd have learned not to be so gullible. Oh, Cyrilda, he took her face into his rough palms. How can you speak these things without so much as a hint of a smile? You nearly had me fooled. Yet again. Where did you get these? Truthfully now. He lifted the locket from her collar, shaking his head. He'd gone pale while she recounted the events of the night before, but the color was now rushing back into his cheeks. Were they a gift from some young lad in town? I've been wondering if you might be sweet on someone and too shy to tell me. Cyrilda stepped back, tucking the locket beneath her dress. She hesitated, tempted to try again, to insist. He had to believe her. For once it was real. It had happened. She wasn't lying, and she might have tried again if it hadn't been for the haunted look lurking behind his gaze, not entirely covered up by his denial. He was worried about her. Despite his strained laughter, he was terrified that this one could be true. She didn't want that. He already worried enough. Of course not, Papa. I'm not sweet on anyone, and when have you ever known me to be shy? She shrugged. If you must know the truth of it, I found the ring stuck around a fairy's toadstool, and I stole the necklace from the skeleton rock who lives in the river. He scoffed. Now that I'd be closer to believing. He went back inside, and Cyrilda knew in the moment, in the deepest corner of her heart, that if he wouldn't believe her, no one would. They had heard far too many tales before. She told herself it was better this way. If she wasn't beholden to the truth of what had happened under the full moon, then she would have no qualms about embellishing it. And she did dearly love to embellish. Speaking of young village lads, Papa called through the open door, I thought I should tell you. Thomas Lindbeck has agreed to help around the mill this spring. The name was a kick to her chest. Thomas Lindbeck, she said, darting back into the house. Hans' brother? What for? You've never hired help before. I'm getting older. Thought it would be nice to have a strapping young man to do some of the heavy lifting. She scowled. You're barely 40. Her father glanced up from stoking the fire, chagrin. Sighing, he set down the poker and stood to face her, brushing off his hands. All right, he came and asked for work. He's hoping to earn some extra coins so that... So that what? She prompted, his hesitation making her tense. His look was pitying in a way that turned her stomach. So he can make a proposal to Bluma Rask, is my understanding. A proposal? Of marriage. I see, said Cyrilda, forcing a tight smile. I didn't realize they were so, well, good. They're a charming match. She glanced at the fireplace. I'll get some apples for our breakfast. Do you want anything else from the cellar? He shook his head, watching her carefully. Her nerves hummed with irritation. She was careful not to stomp or grind her teeth as she headed back outside. What did she care if Thomas Limbeck wanted to marry Bluma Rask, or anyone else for that matter? She had no claim to him. Not anymore. It had been nearly 2 years since he'd stopped looking at Cyrilla like she was the sun itself, and started looking at her like she was a storm cloud brewing ominously in the horizon. When he bothered to look at her at all, that is. She wished a happy life, long life on him and Bluma. A little farmhouse, a yard full of children, endless conversation about the price of livestock and unfavorable weather. A life without curses, a life without stories. Cyrilda paused as she threw open the cellar door where she'd just last night hidden 2 magical creatures. She stood in this very spot and faced down an otherworldly beast and a wicked king and a whole legion of undead hunters. She was not the sort to pine for a simple life, and she would not pine for the likes of Thomas Lindbeck. Stories change with repeated tellings, and hers was no different. The night of the snow moon became increasingly adventurous and more surreal. When she told the tale of to the children, it was not moss maidens she had rescued, but a vicious little water nix who had thanked her only by trying to bite off her fingers before it jumped into the river and disappeared. When Farmer Bauman brought over firewood for the schoolhouse and Gertrude encouraged Cyrilla to repeat the story, she insisted that the Earl King had not ridden upon a black steed, but rather a massive wyvern who blew acrid smoke from his nostrils and oozed molten rock from between its scales. When Cyrilla went to barter for some of Mother Weber's raw wool and was asked by Anna to again repeat the fantastical tale, she dared not explain how she had fooled the Earl King with a lie about her magical spinning abilities. Mother Weber had been the one to teach Cyrilla the technique when she was young, and she had never stopped criticizing Cyrilla for her lack of skill. To this day, she liked to gripe about how the local sheep deserved to have their coats turned into something finer than the lumpy, uneven threads that would come of Cyrilla's bobbins. She probably would have laughed Cyrilla right out of their cottage if she'd heard how Cyrilla had lied to the Earl King about her spinning talents of all things. Instead, Cyrilla turned her story self into a bold warrior. She regaled her small audience with the feat of daring and bravery. How she had been brandished a lethal fire iron, no mere shovel for her, threatening the Earl King and driving away his demon attendants. She mimicked precisely how she had swung, stabbed, and clobbered her enemies. How she had driven the poker into the heart of the hellhound and then flung it out onto the buckets of the water wheel. The children were in stitches, and by the time Cyrilla's story ended with the Earl King fleeing from her with girlish squills and a lump of the size of a goose egg on his head, Anna and her toddler brother ran off to begin their own play acting, deciding who would be Cyrilla and who would be the terrible king. Mother Weber shook her head, but Cyrilla was sure she saw the hint of a smile disguised behind her knitting needles. She tried to enjoy their reactions, the open mouths, the intent gazes, the giddy laughter. Usually this was all she craved. But with every telling, Cyrilla felt that the reality of the story was slipping away from her, becoming fogged over by time and alterations. She wondered how long it would be before she too began to doubt what had transpired that night. Such thoughts filled her with the unexpected regret. Sometimes, when she was alone, she would pull out the chain from beneath the collar of her dress and stare at the portrait of the young girl who she declared a princess in her imagination. Then she would rub her thumb over the engraving on the ring, the tassel worm twisted around an ornate R. She promised herself that she would never forget, not a single detail. A loud call startled Cerilda from her melancholy. She looked up to see a bird watching her through the cottage doorway, which she'd left open to air out the little home while the sun was shining, knowing another winter storm would be upon them any day. And here she was, distracted once again from her task. She was supposed to be spinning all this wool she'd gotten from Mother Weber, turning it into usable yarn for their mending and knitting. The worst sort of work, tedium incarnate. She would rather have been skating on the newly frozen pond or freezing caramel drops in the snow for an evening treat. Instead, she'd been lost in thought again, staring at the small portrait. She shut the locket and tucked it into her dress, pushing back the three-legged stool. She walked around the spinning wheel to the door. She hadn't realized how cold it had gotten. She rubbed her hands together to try to return some warmth to her fingers. She paused, one hand on the door, noticing the bird who had startled her from her reverie. It was perched on one of the barren branches of the hazelnut tree that stood just beyond the garden. It was the biggest raven she'd ever seen, a monstrous shadow of a creature silhouetted against the dusky sky. Sometimes she would toss out breadcrumbs for birds. Probably this one had heard about the feast. "Sincerest apologies," she said, preparing to shut the door. "I have nothing for you today." The bird cocked its head to the side, which is when Cerilda saw it, really saw it. She went still. It had seemed to be watching her before, but now, with a ruffle of its feathers, the bird leapt from the branch. The tree branches swayed and released drifts of powdery snow as the bird soared off into the sky, growing smaller as it beat its heavy wings, heading north in the direction of the ashen wood. Cerilda would have thought nothing of it except the creature had been missing its eyes. There had been nothing to watch her but empty sockets, and when it had taken to the air, bits of violet gray sky had been visible through the threadbare holes in its wings. "Gnat trap," she whispered, bracing herself against the door. "A night raven. Who could kill with one look of its empty eyes if it chose to? Who was said to devour the hearts of children?" She watched until the fiend was out of sight, and her gaze caught on the white moon beginning to rise in the distance, the hunger moon. Rising when the world was at its most desolate, when humans and creatures alike began to wonder if they had stored away enough food to last them through the rest of the dreary winter. 4 weeks had passed. Tonight, the hunt would ride again. With a shaky breath, Cerilda slammed the door shut. So that concludes the first part of the book. So the next book is the Hunter, or the next section of the book is the Hunter Mood. So that concludes our 6 chapter preview.